this liberal Baptist, is focused on redefining Christianity in a way that he believes is fully in line with the best of the Hebrew scriptures and Jesus's own example. He is also someone who is convinced that Christianity is the most evolved and important religious innovation in the history of humankind. So he will defend it to the death and beyond. And so we've had a few encounters with some of the difficulties for us in his thinking. There's obvious things, that he speaks of humanity through a very male perspective. And at this time, the English language had not yet begun to correct the notion that man means all human beings. But this was his world, and frankly, everybody's world until about 1972. And so this book being written in 1917 makes it such that we shouldn't expect them to be different than everybody else around them at the time. And of course, his Christian supersessionalism will get him into trouble, and we'll see a little bit of that. But I think the 4 chapters that we prepared for tonight are really going to help us understand a little more about this text. And so I'm going to show a video first. And this video is going to be something that, go ahead and mute that. All right. And is that one muted?
Yeah, muted.
Then why do I have 2? Okay. All right, so we thought we just solved this problem. Hold on, let me try this. How's that? Can you still hear me?
Yep.
Good. All right, so you're going to have to hear this video in the room from my computer. Otherwise, we won't have a way to do this. All right, give me a second. And someone is trying to get in. Here comes Shirley. Okay. All right. Hello? Good, perfect. And you can hear me just fine now. And now I'm going to play this video. And this comes from a PBS series. It's about 10 minutes long, but so many questions came up about what was going on at this time that I thought it was necessary for us to show this video to situate us more squarely in this time period. And this specifically deals with the Gilded Age, which is a little bit before when this text was written, but it's the Gilded Age that sets up all of the misery and despair and excess and exploitation that Rauschenbusch is responding to.
A vicious cold snap hit New York in the first week of February 1897. But nothing could slow the preparations for the impending revelry. The city's wealthiest citizens were readying themselves for one of the most anticipated balls in the nation's history. An extravagant exclamation point on what would come to be known as the Gilded Age.
During the Gilded Age, Americans feel quite certainly that they are the vanguard of civilization and progress. There's an enormous period of opportunity and possibility and hope.
No group felt more confident about the future than the guests who would gather for the party at the luxurious Waldorf Hotel. The evening's total price tag, according to newspaper reports, was enough to feed nearly 1,000 working-class families for a full year. Defenders noted that the ball stood to benefit the entire city. Critics begged to differ. With all the people, warned one minister, who have to lie awake nights contriving to spend their time and their money, and all the others who lie awake wondering how they may get food, there is danger in the air.
It was a fractious time in which a sense of desperation amidst growing wealth was emerging.
Increasingly, workers begin to say, if I, as a member of this society, lack the ability to pay my bills and to feed my family, then I am not a free citizen of a healthy republic. I'm something else, something that the Founding Fathers would not recognize.
The magnitude of the late 19th century transformation of American society is hard to exaggerate. It was as if you woke up in one country and you went to bed in another.
30 years after the Civil War, America had transformed into an economic powerhouse. But the transformation had created stark new divides in wealth, standing, and opportunity.
It's shocking for people to see a country developing before them that is increasingly clearly divided into the haves and have-nots.
Gilded is not golden. Gilded has the sense of a patina covering something else. It's the shiny exterior and the rot underneath.
By the time New York's elite gathered at the Waldorf Ballroom, the richest 4,000 families in the country, less than 1% of all Americans, had scooped up nearly as much treasure as the other 11.6 million families combined. "We are the rich," one partygoer remarked. "We own America. We got it, God knows how, but we intend to keep it if we can."
There is this fight over what is America's collective self-identity. Who are we? Are we two nations, the poor and the wealthy? Or are we one nation where everybody has a chance to succeed?
When this nation comes out of the Civil War, we are still a nation divided by regions. There's very little national market. If you need a pair of shoes, you don't get it from a factory 100 miles away. You get it from the local shoe maker.
Life was much, much more local, much more what was going on right around you, what your neighbors were doing, what your friends were doing, what your enemies were doing, and how you were doing on a day-to-day basis.
America had been founded, its political system had been founded for a country of farmers. But it was becoming a nation of industrialists, becoming a nation of urban workers. It was becoming a nation of cities. Railroads knit the entire country together in a way that hadn't existed before. So now merchants, manufacturers, industrialists can think nationally. You don't have to think simply in terms of your local market. If you have a good idea, if you have a good procedure for producing something, you can think of selling your goods all over the country.
By the early 1880s, the nation's largest corporation, the Pennsylvania Railroad, carried more than 2 million tons of industrial and consumer goods every year. Steel left mills in Pittsburgh for destinations around the country. So too did refined oil from Cleveland, factory-made furniture from Cincinnati, and harvesters from Chicago. Railroads moved coal from Wyoming, timber from Oregon, silver from Nevada and Colorado, and copper from Montana. tens of thousands of young men and women from farm families could hop on the train to go where the jobs were, the newly industrializing cities. Former slaves and their children joined the urban migration, bound for new opportunities in Memphis, Atlanta, Richmond, or as far north as Philadelphia and New York.
The hope.
One more time, I'm just going to try and get this a little more stable. We'll see if this is any better. Okay. This might be the one.
Is for equality and for first-class citizenship, and to be a part of what is happening in terms of progress and change. They're trying to make the democracy and the country work for them.
Progress is part of the American credo and has been almost from the beginning of the nation. Americans prided themselves on their inventiveness, their ingenuity, their entrepreneurial get up and go.
Progress is thought of as inevitable. It's divinely inspired. There's a pastor who talked about these technological innovations as God's tools to make a more perfect society. And so it becomes almost a spiritual idea, this industrial spirit.
One of the most innovative entrepreneurs of the day was Andrew Carnegie. He owned a stable full of fine-blooded horses and enjoyed taking long rides through Central Park. In the spring of 1881, he was a man in the saddle in all ways, having just consolidated his growing manufacturing enterprises under a single banner, Carnegie Brothers and Company.
It would be easy to cook them on the grill.
Some days, Carnegie would ride out of the park and head north on Upper Broadway. Other days, he would ride all the way to the High Bridge, where traffic loosened and he could open up to a gallop along the banks of the Harlem River. In the few hours he was out riding through New York, his blast furnaces 300 miles to the west produced more than 60 tons of steel and earned him about as much as the average American made in a year. This remarkable and novel fact made 45-year-old Andrew Carnegie the emblem of a new kind of American dream. Like John D. Rockefeller in the oil refining business, and Cornelius Vanderbilt in railroads, Carnegie was riding a wave of industrialization, using new technology and mass production to secure enormous personal wealth.
What's important to realize is that these men, they have visions. Carnegie, Rockefeller, the railroad barons, they don't invent anything. They're managers.
Carnegie is one of the few American millionaires of this era or any other who can genuinely call himself a self-made man. He really does come from humble origins.
Okay. We will stop that screen share. One on the left. The one on the left, there's the other one. Yep, and turn that one off because that gives a glare. Thank you. All right. Turn that one on and I'll turn this one off. Got it. All right. So there's a beginning. I have another one to show next week. We saw the one last week that talked about some of the horrors of the industrial age. So that was our first class. And so what's happened is something brand new has come into being, and the ability to make way more money than anyone had ever thought possible has come about. And this is before we've had any understanding of the rights of workers to organize and demand better pay and working conditions. And this is before that there have been laws about public health and safety, before there have been laws about hiring children even and things like that. So this is the context from which the text that we have takes off. All right, so let's look at the text. So those of you who have taken my classes know that I really want us to always ground our discussions in the text that we have, and you've done a great job of that the first couple classes. And so what I ask you to prepare each week is something simple, and it's share something that you liked or loved from the reading, share something that you did not like, and then share something that you found confusing. Okay? So here we are with that, and so I'm going to invite anyone. Yeah.
The door is locked to the office where the coffee is. Can you unlock it?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I just need something to drink so that I can like talk. Sorry.
No, yeah.
Thank you.
All right, who wants to go first with some observation from the text of something that they liked or loved? I see Mary Jones.
I'll start. What I loved and agreed
hear
with.
Mary Jones.
Can you hear me?
I know. Wait, we got it's our fault.
I think it was us. Go ahead, Mary.
Okay. What I loved about the text, the reading, was chapter 6, the second paragraph. I felt he hit everything dead on. But then he goes into chapter 7. And chapter 7 bothered me. His concept of sin, when he talks about mental illness and addiction, genetics, and then he goes on further into saying, after he explains all of this stuff about genetics, and I'm trying to understand. I had to do the same thing. I had to go back to 1917 in my head and get a feel. This was only 50 years after Mendel did his experiment with the beans and got a genetic pattern. So this was relatively new, this whole concept of genetics. And although he attacks the church and he attacks so much, by the end of chapter 7, he seems to be placing the onus of what he considers sin completely on the shoulders of the people in society that he just praised in chapter 6. So that confused me.
All right. So what Mary just shared is she was particularly fond of the second paragraph there in chapter 6, which reads something like this: we are equipped with powerful appetites. We are often placed in difficult situations which constitute overwhelming temptation. We are all relatively ignorant, and while we experiment with life, we go astray. Some of our instincts may become rampant and overgrown and then trample on our inward freedom. We are gifted with high ideals, with a wonderful range of possibilities, with aspirations and longing, and also weighted with inertia and moral incapacity to achieve. We are keenly alive to the call of the senses and the pleasures of the moment, and only dimly and occasionally conscious of our own higher destiny, of the mystic value of personality in others and of God. And so he shares this, but then he also has a corrective or something that makes it more rich to me at the end of the next paragraph. He says, no doubt we are involved in objective wrong and evil. We frustrate our possibilities, we injure others, we disturb the divine harmonies. We are unfree, unhappy, conscious of a burden which we are unable to lift or escape. And we're not going to try to answer all these questions because this is our first response from folks lifting up questions here. What he's going to do further on in this chapter, though, is to really expand this definition out. He's going up against a couple of contrary things that he seems to be both a liberal and a conservative at the same time, theologically, a theological conservative. Not necessarily a theological liberal. And he will really come to a certain point, not unlike that of the great universe. There's the notion that human beings are placed onto earth with incomplete knowledge. And because of that incomplete knowledge, we make all kinds of mistakes because we do not know exactly what the consequences of our actions will be. And this is a limit on our freedom because we're not always free to do as much of the right thing as we would like to think we could be, right? And so in the end, what he does is he ends up making sure that we have a notion that our freedom is conditioned. And with this, Ballou uses that to base universal salvation upon. What Rauschenbusch is doing it for is I believe he's trying to give us a deeper sense of sympathy for average people who don't always know the right thing to do. And then, because what he wants to focus on are the social causes of sin and how sin is often, in his mind, most injurious when it negatively affects the most people. And then what Mary refers to next, there was a whole lot of new genetic understanding happening at this time. Much of it gets misdirected. Some of it gets co-opted for scientific racism and other things. And some of it gets misdirected to suggest that biology is determinative, that we only have the ability to be what our biology says. I don't think that is actually what Rauschenbusch is saying. He only mentions eugenics at one point in this entire, any of his texts. He mentions it at the end of chapter 7. But it's sort of as an aside, as something that he doesn't take seriously. We'll actually come to that directly at the end of the class. All right, who else wants to share their 3 responses? Something you liked or loved, something you disliked, or something that confused you? Yes.
Deborah does.
Go ahead, Deborah.
I don't know if I have all 3 together. I just wanted to say with one that I really liked on page 35, a few pages into chapter 4, because it sounds so contemporary. One of the culminating accusations of Jesus against the theological teachers of his time was that they strained out gnats and swallowed camels, judiciously laying the emphasis on the minor sins and keeping silence on the profitable major wrongs. It is possible to hold the orthodox doctrine on the devil and not recognize him when we meet him in a real estate office or at the stock exchange, which sort of sounded right out of the 1% take over Wall Street, so. And
So I see where you picked that one up. You picked that one up. Yeah, stock exchange. Where is that? Yeah, I see the culminating accusations. That's where you started. And so, yeah, and I just go back just a little bit farther. So what he's trying to do there is argue against folks rejecting the social gospel because it's easy to see what's new about it, right? Why it's different from what came before. And he says in other places in the text that we've ignored what we've been told was the true way to understand things, because it's sort of become the background of our understanding. It's become like the fabric of just our discourse and our assumptions. Yes. What did you find that you didn't like so much, Deborah, if anything?
I didn't find anything that I didn't like. And the one thing I was confused about, which in the text is around 55, 56, the last couple of pages of chapter 6, when he talks about parasitism.
Yes.
And the only point I have of confusion is he talks about, you know, it's a sin to not be productive. So I don't know if this is what Mary was alluding to a little bit, that is he blaming the people he's trying to help. But I thought, considering you just showed the 10 minutes on page, are those people sinful for they weren't really workers? And were they parasites because they lived off the labor of so many people who served to make them billionaires? So who were the parasites was a little bit confusing to me.
I think you answered the question appropriately at the end. You know, he says in that part of the text, in fact, throughout history, the policy of most states has been shaped in order to make a sinful condition easy and perpetual, that people who have been under the teachings of Christianity all their lives don't even see that parasitism is a sin. And there's a little bit of personal responsibility, but he's talking more about what he would call the exploiting classes, those who are just the managers and those who are making all the money because of other people, you know, working their fingers to the bone so they can be wealthy. That's normally what he's referring to as parasitism. He does confuse his argument, as you noted, because one of the ways that he keeps conservatives in his argument, he believes, I'm not sure how many conservatives he kept in his argument, or at least not by 1917, is he does preach a pretty strong message about personal responsibility. You know, he wants to make it clear that, you know, we have a duty to do things and to, you know, so because it's selfish for us to not take care of ourselves and provide for ourselves, for instance. That's, you know, he says at the very next paragraph from where you quoted, the accepted definition of sin as selfishness is wholly in line with the social gospel, and it can back up the old theology examples of high-powered selfishness, which seem to have been overlooked. So this is part of the polemic part of the text, meaning that he's trying to make an argument why the social gospel, you don't have to throw away all your old theology, but you do have to adopt this different lens of what sin is in order to have a more complete understanding of the problems that are before us, as well as to understand the religion that you say you believe in.
Thank you.
All right. Who else has something they want to share? Giancarlo's right here.
So it's something to go off of Deborah's points that I really found that I liked in the text is the idea that you do have to earn a living, but you can't. There's a certain point you can't earn. No one can earn. 1% of people can't possibly deserve and earn more than the rest of the 99% of people. And this part confused me. On page 20 on the Kindle, the more theology, because this is how he talks about the fall of man, the fall of people. The more theology bases all its reasoning on the doctrine of the fall, the greater the collapse and mental distress when a man comes to realize that the biblical story of the fall will not bear the tremendous weight which the theological system of the past has put on it. And I'm just very confused as to
how does that paragraph begin, so I can find it too?
It begins, of course, evolutionary thought.
Okay.
Strategy change.
Got it. All right, so let's read that paragraph. So where is he, what's he talking about here? He's talking about the traditional doctrine of the fall. And interestingly, for someone who is theologically conservative, he seems to be okay with not embracing original sin, which is definitely not orthodox among Baptists in 1917. Because one of the problems that he has a two-edged sword about original sin. He thinks original sin has let people off the hook by suggesting that I have this stain of sin that only I can remove with faith. He criticizes, Luther is starting that notion that somehow all we have to do is get right with Jesus, and then no matter how horrible we've been, all of our wrongs are forgiven. He doesn't really believe that. And he also believes that original sin it creates too negative of a view of all humanity. But what he does like about the notion of Adam and the fall is that it creates the unity of humankind. He talks about that a little bit later in the book. That somehow, Adam, the first cherished person, at least in the story, makes a big mistake. We all make big mistakes. And so it's something that ties us together on a deeper human level. So let's just read some of that paragraph here. Yes, so I would go up a little bit further where it says the traditional doctrine. The traditional doctrine of the fall has taught us to regard evil as a kind of unvarying racial endowment. And there he means human race, which is active in every new life and which can overcome only by the grace offered in the gospel. So he's pushing back against that. And he's saying, and he's very scientifically minded, like many persons of his age. Of course, evolutionary thought has radically changed the conceptions about the origin of the human race for those whose thinking is done under the influence of evolutionary science. Such will take little interest in the discussion of this chapter. But there are many conservative minds who cannot recast their thought in wholly new molds. The story of the fall is a serious religious and intellectual burden to those who are more conservative. In other words, he's suggesting that they have embraced so thoroughly a need for the doctrine of the fall of humanity and original sin to understand their world that they're not willing to question it because it's too foundational for them. And so what he's suggesting then in the next sentence, the more theology bases all its reasoning on the doctrine of the fall, the greater is the collapse and mental distress when a person comes to realize that the biblical story of the fall will not bear the tremendous weight which the theological system of the past has put upon it. So what he's saying, it's not a good idea to put a lot of our trust in faulty old doctrines that now seem to not make much sense. Because what that'll do is that'll create weak Christians. So this is he wants strong Christians. He wants to build Christianity on principles that are rock solid. He doesn't want Christianity to be built in things that intelligent people and new scientific discoveries are going to tear asunder. So that's how I understand those passages. Does that make sense to those of you who may have read this similarly? Okay. All right. And was there something else? No, you shared yours, right? Is that correct?
Yes, but I was just
Yeah.
confused on, so he's calling the theory of the fall, it is not, or is no longer in his eyes a solid foundation for theology or for.
Yes.
Okay.
That's exactly what he's trying to make. He's trying to make it without making it too strong because he wants to keep the conservatives reading this. But what he comes up to, you might remember later on, he talks about how, what kind of transgression really was Adam's sin? Because it was just him, Eve, God, and the serpent. And what Rauschenbusch is going to come back to time and time again is that the true measure of sin is the number of people that it injures. And so his question in some ways is who did Adam's transgression actually injure other than Adam?
He was 25% of everyone who existed.
That's right. Well, I don't think it's a percentage. For him, it's not right. Yeah, that's right. That's right. That's right. So yeah, 1/4 of you, and he was half of humankind. So yes. And of course, in the story, Eve gets punished too. So he gets everybody in trouble, literally. But there are only two everybody's at this moment in time. So yeah, so I think he's trying to say we shouldn't base a theology for a robust religion on fairy tales that whose meanings we might have misunderstood. That's kind of what he's saying. The liberals will say it more directly, just like that. He doesn't want to say it that directly because he knows the liberals already understand this. And there's a couple places in this text where he deliberately criticizes liberal theology because he wants the conservatives to see, look, I have liberal social views, but I'm not that liberal theologically. And so he's doing a dance. Yeah.
Can I ask?
Yeah, of course.
How does that, his perspective, 104 years later, what would be included? I mean, I'm not asking for a list, but I'm just saying that there is so much 104 years later, which would also some disgruntlement among Christians.
So yeah, that's a great question.
Science.
That's a great question. So the truth is, contemporary American Christianity is about as conservative theologically, if not more so, than in Rauschenbusch's time. So the largest Christian churches in this country, the evangelical movements, the Southern Baptists and all those, the conservative wings of Lutheranism and Methodism and other Christian denominations are much less willing to question some of these core doctrines of virgin birth, of, not only Jesus's resurrection, but going down into hell and all that stuff in the Apostles' Creed, of the fall of humanity, of original sin. They're much less willing to criticize it today, in my reading of them, than they were 100 years ago.
The second coming of Christ.
They definitely do not question the second coming. That's what they're basing everything on, which is why they're telling you you need to get right with Jesus.
Right.
So you get on the right spaceship or whatever it is that they No, that's true. That's true. And American Christianity, so like the left wing of American Christianity, which we're out on the front of in many ways, that version of Christianity, has really gone very far in the other direction. At this point, Unitarianism was accepting of folks who weren't necessarily Christian. Universalism wasn't. Universalism was still very much a Christian movement, almost exclusively. It's not until 1933 in the Humanist Manifesto where we see an opening to different understandings of theology and not expecting everyone to be a doctrinaire Christian to be a member of a Unitarian or a Universalist congregation. And really from 1933, we've gone much farther than most of the other denominations that emerged out of Protestantism.
Sorry, just you mentioned that he's saying it, while problematic, the fall creates a common humanity, or creates a unity of humankind. Mm-hmm. So you're saying that in his view, we're supposed to see ourselves in Adam and empathize with him instead of blaming him.
Yeah.
So okay.
Yeah. Yes. Yes. That's a good way to put it. Mm-hmm. We should recognize ourselves in Adam's inability to do the right thing when he didn't think God was looking. Yes, that's exactly what he's trying to get us to understand. Yeah. All right. Who else has an observation they want to lift up for us all? I see Nicole. The room's getting hot in here. I'm telling you, it's everyone's. All right. What do you have for us, Nicole?
Okay, so I liked a lot of things, but there were two things I really liked. I liked on page 36 in the book, and 37, the explication of sin.
Mm-hmm.
We feel a deep consciousness of sin when we realize that we've wasted our years, dissipated our energies, left our opportunities unused, frustrated the grace of God, and dwarfed and shamed the personality which God intended when he called us into life. It is a similar and even deeper misery to realize that our past life was hurt and blocked the kingdom of God, the sum of all good, the essential aim of God himself. So oh, and then further down, this part, to have failed it by our weakness, to have hampered it by our ignorance, to have resisted its prophets, to have contradicted its truths, to have denied it in times of danger, to have betrayed it for 30 pieces of silver. This is the most poignant consciousness of sin. I love that. Right? It's like the thing that the Gilded Age, that reference to the Gilded Age, this idea that it's shining and bright. There's this patina on the outside, and it's just rotten to the core inside. And so that's what he's talking about. You could tithe, you could be a perfect tither, right? Like that's a point of reference, I know, in the Baptist church. But if if you haven't used your time on earth to do good things to make the world a better place, then it's just symbolic. It's just even though they didn't say it like that.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. I mean, and we see this in the Hebrew prophets. I mean, Amos is the most famous, probably. I despise your festivals. I get ill at the sound of your songs. That's deliberate exaggeration, because what Amos is calling out, you think just by going through the motions and singing the songs and lighting the candles that somehow that means you're righteous, but it doesn't. It's what is it that you're doing for the poor and the immigrant and the widow and the orphan? What are you doing for the sick and the needy? And this is exactly where Rauschenbusch is basing his theology for the social gospel, right in that ancient Hebrew understanding of righteousness, which is righteousness for the people, not just righteousness for me. Right.
And then here's what I did not like. So I actually kind of struggled with his explication of sin, because some of it actually spoke to me, like the part on alcohol, until he started talking about barbarism, and I'm like, that's too much. But on page 60, he writes about sin and vices. He says the evil habits of boyhood, lying, stealing, cigarette smoking, profane and obscene talk, self-pollution, are usually set up in boys by the example. In social persuasion, boys just one stage older than they. One generation corrupts the next. The permanent vices and crimes of adults are not transmitted by heredity, but by being socialized. For instance, alcoholism and all drug evils, cruel sports such as bullfights and pugilism, various forms of sex perversity, voluntary deformities such as foot binding, corseting, piercing of ears and nose, blood feuds in Corsica, lynching in America. I mean, to me, there's something deeply wrong with this. I mean, because basically he used this, he made lynching in America bad, like getting your ears pierced. And perversity of sexuality, to me, is very dangerous. There's some, I feel that lurking in this part of the book, he's like, killing people's wrong, as is perverse sexuality and piercing your ears and your nose. And, he talks about things, foot binding, corseting. I mean, he's basically being culturally insensitive in many ways, It's
Absolutely
a
normal for the time.
Say that again, Fox.
I said absolutely normal for the time. It was an androcentric world.
Yep.
It was a white-centric, a Eurocentric world.
Right.
Binding of the feet is Chinese.
Yep.
The piercing is Hindu. Tattooing is Native American. None of those are white cultures. So it's a perfectly normal attitude for him to have that we have in some part, maybe even large part, overcome. what people do to their own bodies in terms of decoration, we no longer recoil in horror about. Now, granted, there are some that I go, why in God's green earth would you have done that? But society-wise, we don't condemn them for having done it. May question their sanity, but we don't condemn them for having done it anymore.
Yeah, so he's speaking
You've got
of
it,
these
you know, you've got the dichotomy of what
Yep.
his life was like in our hopefully more modern times and better, less bigoted times now. And I'm using bigoted as a Catholic word, as in universal, not as in racial.
I can't see who's talking.
Oh, she doesn't have her camera on. That's all.
Yeah.
The reference to lynching is a criticism of white culture.
Oh,
In
absolutely.
America. Lynching in America, that has to be what she was referring to.
Yeah, that is what he's referring to.
Yeah, he's referring to.
Yeah, and the other thing to think about with this too is that, like all of us, he is a product of his culture, and in some ways he transcended it, and in some ways, just like that sermon I did a couple weeks ago, culture eats the truth for breakfast, right? And so, he comes out of the Victorian era, where certain segments of our society really bought into the Calvinistic notion that in order for you to be considered a good person, and to them a good Christian, was that you showed certain signs of being elected to the kingdom of heaven. And what that kind of meant was that you didn't do certain things. You did not drink at all, or if you did, you only had like a glass of wine with a meal once in a great deal of time. You did not pierce, you did not do those things to your body, and there is this understanding, because of their belief that human progress was linear, and that they were closer to achieving the ideal of living into the kingdom of God than any generation before them. Sometimes their impatience and their desire to be better made them unable to see how some behaviors were merely cultural differences, and because they didn't have that understanding much yet. There was no understanding of admiring cultures of the world for what kind of, as in their own ends. Now there was also significant criticism in this time, and I think some of it's well placed, including there were a lot of Americans in the late part of the 1800s that worked with reformers in India to try to get rid of some of the things like bride burning, if you know that old custom.
Sati, yeah.
Yeah. And so, if a man died, if they were a member of a certain segment of society, his wife had to be killed too. And so, I think we have a right to criticize other cultures, so long as we're being aware of our own stuff, because that's just how we learn and understand. But I don't think any of us would say just anything that any culture does is okay. It's just what they do. We can look at Afghanistan in right now that we don't think that what they're doing and how they seem to be, treating women is something that we, want to just say is okay, right? So it's definitely a dance. Yep, and you definitely notice something that's really there, and we've got to be aware of, not just in him but in ourselves. Yeah. Anything confusing?
Yes, there was something confusing. So for example, the way he used the word sensual throughout, and sensuousness, the way he spoke of this word.
Yep.
So on page 45, right. We are keenly alive to the call of the senses and the pleasures of the moment, and only dimly and occasionally conscious of our own higher destiny, of the mystic value of personality in others and of God. This sensual equipment, this ignorance and inertia out of which our moral delinquencies sprout, are part of our human nature. So, I mean, again, and it's just this, oh yeah, and then on page 47, again, it's the first paragraph to the book. The three forms of sin, sensuousness, selfishness, and godlessness, are ascending and expanding stages in which we sin against our higher self, against the good of men, and against the universal good. So yeah, this is confusing to me because I actually like the fact that he wrote universal good instead of God. Like that is leaning towards something universal. Selfishness and godlessness perhaps can be sins, but in which capacity is he using the word sensuousness? This is, you know, I see this kind of underlying drumbeat of like, you know, references to sexual perversity. It sounds like there's some real hypocrisy here.
Well, it's the cultural assumption of his age and class, you know, meaning that you know, you were aware that you had a body, but you weren't supposed to actually pretend to enjoy it. So it really is. Man, somebody found that funny. Exciting. And so, you know, that's just the assumption of the time. And when he says this, the three forms of sin, sensuousness, selfishness, and godlessness, are ascending and expanding. So he's saying sensuousness is actually the lower violation. He's ranking them, right? He's saying that, yeah, okay, everyone's worried about this and about, yeah, all right. But then what he ends up doing is he ends up collapsing selfishness and godlessness, and will eventually define sin as almost wholly about selfishness. Because when he says all we're worried about is the self and not all the other people around me, all the other people who were brought into being with divine love, all people who were supposed to be cohabitating with and figuring this out with, you know, that's the greatest sin. And he gets to just a couple paragraphs down. The definition of sin as selfishness furnishes an excellent theological basis for a social conception of sin and salvation. So you know, this notion of selfishness, he wouldn't be taken seriously as a minister writing in 1917 if he just suggested that anything goes between consenting adults. I don't think that was actually, that actually comes about a little bit by the end of the 1920s, right. Not just in society, right, yeah, but in his time and in his formation, you know, right. Growing up in the late 1800s, no.
Very pre-pronouns.
Yeah.
I want to be Pollyannish, but sensuality, we have five senses.
That's right.
And the drive for maximum sensory gratification can embody all five of the senses. Gluttony, for one sense, and the sense of touch, covering, you know, the yearning for furs and diamonds, and this is all sensuality also in addition to.
Right. Okay. Yeah, and that is a sin.
Well, but it would fall into selfishness eventually.
Yeah.
Right.
All right. So who else? Thank you, Nicole. Great things to pick up. All right. Anyone else have something they want to lift up from the text? Something that you like, love, confused by, disliked?
Yeah.
Yes.
I don't think I liked, but.
Where are you? Beginning of chapter 7.
Chapter 7, page 58.
Page 58 in chapter 7. The transmission.
In the book or in the?
In the book, in the middle of page 24.
And it begins science or the depravity.
Yeah, the depravity of will and corruption of nature are transmitted wherever life itself is transmitted. And then science to some extent corroborates the doctrine of original sin, who was flowed down the generations through the channels of biological awareness.
Yes.
That I didn't care for.
Yep. Yeah. So he's tying something, he's making some statements that we might have a hard time making today here. So they were theologians in his time, liberal or conservative, were fine calling more things evil than we might be comfortable calling evil. So, natural disasters were routinely something that were called evil in their time. Things like, if you were born, with some kind of, challenge, they would call that evil. And not in the evil sense that we mean, it would be more in the sense that, some great, terrible thing has touched us. And, but then he's suggesting, and he gets a little too close to biological determinism here, in that sentence that Debbie read, evil does flow down, he writes, the generations through the channels of biological coherence, idiocy and feeble-mindedness, neurotic disturbances, weaknesses of inhibition, all the stubbornness, all this stuff. He comes back later on to say that's not really what we should be focusing on. We need to be focusing on the social aspects. Yet, there it is. And he's a man of his age. And there again, someone mentioned it earlier, how the study of genetics was and it was difficult for folks who believe in this linear notion of human progress to think that somehow, the next generation carries on some of these unfortunate aspects of humanity, because it was a puzzle for them. Why, even if it seems to have been inherited, why hasn't it been corrected over time? They really did not have a very thorough understanding.
That ran counter to their constant progress.
They ran counter to their constant progress.
Yeah.
But there was no understanding either of the social aspects of many of those things that he was referring to. A lot of that has to do with the fact that people were living in what we would now call a slum.
That's right.
And
So
if you're living in a slum and you're not getting enough to eat and you have no medical care and you're being worked to death, you're going to take advantage of whatever few enjoyments you have, including sex. It may be the only good thing in your life.
Yeah.
He didn't, while he's talking about a social gospel, he did not recognize that a large portion of what he's condemning is socially driven, just like the attitudes of white supremacy and bigotry in all of its forms. And my God is holier than thou. And, just go on down the line with almost half of what he calls sin is the product of social living.
That's right. Things like
particularly in
factors we know can create, birth defects, for instance. They may not have known any of that at the time, though he does talk about, pollution and unclean living conditions. But, the depth of their understanding of how it can affect more than just the person who's alive now, perhaps. Yeah, it's problematic. I mean, we're sort of watching. We're watching it. That's why it's so sad that he died the next year, right? It would be interesting to see what he would have written 20 years after this, if he could have, corrected some of this stuff that we have issues with. He's 55 or 56 when he writes this, and so, yeah, we don't know where his thought's going, but a lot of this is he worked on this book for a long time. Christianity and Social Crisis came out 10 years before this book. And he worked for a long time, and he kept being unhappy with what he was coming up with, because he was afraid that the people who needed to read it would not read it. And he kept revising it to sort of speak to the conservatives, because the country was growing more progressive all around him. So he didn't need to preach to the choir, he felt. He wanted to reach people who were resisting the notion that Christianity needs a social component Otherwise, all of our talk of salvation is blank.
Too bad we can't get this into evangelical churches.
No, I mean, it's interesting. The evangelical churches briefly flirt with social gospel and quickly.
No, I meant the book itself.
Oh, yeah, that's true. They end up doing two things: only permitting direct service as far as social justice work, like a feeding ministry or a clothing ministry. And the only kind of social activism they're willing to do is to try to make the state, meaning our nation, adopt its theological claims as the law of the United States. This is what we saw in Texas with the abortion law. This is what we're going to see, all over the country right now. They just came up. I can't remember what state it was in. Might have been Texas, but it was somewhere in the traditional American South with 55 problematic books. So now they're going to start banning books again, right? We go through this every 50 to 80 years, and anyway, so he was trying to keep these people from going there, but whatever.
They don't listen.
Right. Yes. Giancarlo, and then who's next? Might have been Foxy. Go ahead, Giancarlo.
I was just to comment on Reverend Foxy's points of smoking and sex and drinking, especially drinking. The environments and the crushing conditions that they live in. I both agree with the sentiment that they're under, they gives that they're under this crushing pressure from their oppressors. But then I sort of disagree, or at least lose the script when he goes on to the next chapter and starts condemning these behaviors. And these people, they're not drinking and smoking because they're consumed with the sensuous desires, as you say, and they do it because it relieves anxiety and depression.
They're not undergrads like partying every night.
Right.
Yeah, they're people surviving.
Yeah, they're
finding.
They're self-medicating.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. All right.
That kind of dovetails to the question that I had. Maybe Rev Scott can find it in there or not, but the concept of the consciousness of sin seems like a broad basket, and I just wondered how I would find the parameters of that. How do I recognize this term is repeated throughout.
Yeah, well, no Baptist ever got promoted for not talking about sin. So this is more problematic in Unitarian Universalist circles than most other religious circles. We have sadly not revised our own understanding of sin or making significant mistakes or missing the mark, whatever euphemisms you want to use. We really haven't done a good job of being able to speak about what is wrong, in ways that are rich and echo across other religious landscapes. We're good at talking about social justice things that need to happen because they're in opposition to something that's wrong. But we're good at talking about it from a political and social standpoint, but we're not good at talking about it from a religious standpoint. And so when he's speaking about sin, what he's trying to get to the core of is what most Christians of his time, including Universalists and including, the vast majority of Unitarians, even in 1917, that, how do we account for sin? What is sin? Because if you can't define what is sin, then how do you know what to avoid? And so he has to go through the traditional understandings of what sin is. And you know, he even at the same time that he's criticizing that there's too much of a focus on personal conduct, whether it's sexuality or drinking or body decoration or whatever it is, his main point is still there is a social conception of sin that we need to understand, because the people of his day did not understand it as sin. They may have understood it as a social problem. He's trying to get them to understand it also as a religious problem. And he's trying to get them to mobilize their own belief and their own faith and their own religious communities to do something about it from the standpoint that not only is this a social problem, but this is sinful. And it needs to stop. And the way it needs to stop is we need to appeal to those who are causing it. You know, so in a personal, if your doctrine of sin is about personal behavior, then you go to the person who's sinning, say it's me, and I'm drinking too much, you know, and you appeal to that individual to change their individual behavior. But what he sees as much more important, and I think will be fleshed out more in the next 5 chapters, is let's look at the sin that causes the greatest amount of damage. So, but he can't get there without this long conventional and orthodox understandings of what sin is. And so in that way, the book is nowhere near as useful to us in those moments, because we don't need that tour, right? We're already with him that there's a social component of sin, that social sin is what creates the most misery and injury on this planet, sometimes to this planet, you know, but he can't go right there. He's got to take them through the whole journey, or else they're not going to take him seriously, and they're going to stop reading. I don't know how far they would have read anyway, but I think he honestly believes he can keep conservatives along. And like, we're not going to read some of the end of the book. It's all an apologetic for this from a very orthodox Christian point of view that if you're interested in, I can talk to you about, but we're not going to go over some of those long ending chapters. We're going to focus on the social concept of sin and how does it get addressed and how do you combat it, you know, the hardest thing and the thing we keep asking us to come back to is what can be our religious definition of sin, not just the social understanding, not just social problem, not just political. What is a religious definition of sin? And that's what I hope we can compose individually and maybe together. Maybe we come up with something that we need to write an article about for the UU world. But well, there was 2 writers to my right, as a matter of fact. Not that I would ever impose upon their talents and their grace. Anyway, so that's anyway. So this is, you should, you know, as Unitarian Universalist, you should be irritated by a lot of this. I mean, I didn't just pick this book because I thought it was great and wonderful and set the story straight.
Yeah.
You know, I picked it because it's prickly and it says crap I wish he didn't say, and I hope none of us say. But I want us to re-enter the theological conversation to come up with a meaningful and useful doctrine of sin. And I want this to be the start of that foundation, because I think we can understand sin as social sin, especially as he outlines it. If that makes sense. All right, anything else people want to lift up?
I want to ask you a question.
Yes.
Are we doing this from a strictly Christian perspective? Because
No,
the concept of sin exists in every religion with which I'm familiar.
That's exactly correct. And so we're starting there because that's where the text starts us. But the last class or the last class and a half is going to be, what can we use from Rauschenbusch? What ought we better leave behind? And what is it for us? That's, to me, what's more exciting and liberating. It has much more potential than just being able to say what he's, try to, just summarize what he wrote. I mean, we're trying to understand what he wrote so we can practice our theological criticism of what he wrote and see what we can garner to build our own doctrine of sin. Because I think one of the things that I fear for Unitarian Universalism is that if we're not speaking in grounded, well-composed theological language, most of the other religions of our culture just don't take us seriously. They will say things like, your values are sound secular values, and they may agree with our political ends and our social vision, but they don't see it as religious. And it's my drive. What makes me do this and love doing this is to make it religious and theological and ground it in a faith tradition that we can defend and that we can articulate and that we can share with others from their faith traditions, and not just say, oh, the thing that irritates me, it's probably too strong. The thing that disappoints me, I'll be your father. The thing that disappoints me the most is when I have a conversation with Unitarian Universalists and I want them to have a deeper understanding of something from a religious perspective, and their answer is, I don't read the Bible because I don't believe in it. And to me, that's just sad, because we've missed an opportunity to be part of the larger cultural conversation of faith. And it doesn't have to be biblically based, but we have to know what to say about it. It doesn't, you don't have to be Bible believing. I'm not that, I don't think any of us are. But we need to know how to account for the received tradition so we can critique it eloquently and with grace, and we can have our own meaningful claims upon which we build a real doctrine of not just how to live a meaningful life, but also how to point out what's wrong and not just from a political perspective. The last thing that we should be doing is just sounding like another, news pundit, from a particular political perspective. That's not useful, and certainly not to anyone who doesn't already agree with us. Anyway, so you guys got me preaching again. It's not my fault, I swear.
I have a question for you regarding.
Oh, yes, right to Nicole after Mary. Go ahead, Mary.
Yeah. Do you want us to work on that from this point on? What we
I want you to work on it from this point on. Yes.
You want it for next week or by the end of the course?
Yes. As soon as you have something to share it. The end of the course is November 18th, I believe, is our last week.
We have some time. So how are you, to follow up on Mary's question, how are you defining religious? And do you want us to posit this statement in religious texts or?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, that's good. And I'll have it a little more fleshed out. I just actually came up with this preparing the class today. So, but it needs to be recognizable as theological discourse. It can't just be like, it can't just look like a statement about social policy.
Can there be a theological discourse without God?
Yes. So you weren't here the first couple of weeks. I'll make sure in my theological glossary that I shared, God is not a necessary component for theological discourse. And at least in the academy and certainly in the left wing of religion, it's been accepted that theology is the search for that which is, we believe, to be of ultimate meaning and importance, that which is transcendent. Doesn't have to be theistic, but it has to be something that you can build a life in a community around, that promotes human thriving. It's all that stuff. So there's some definitions on that document that'll help you understand it that way. I always encourage folks, whenever you compose something like this, to, as much as you can, be a part of the theological conversation of the ages. You know, so if there's something that you like from Rauschenbusch or from the Bible or the Quran or any other religious text, you know, use that. You know, use that. I mean, you know, because then you've broadened your audience to be people who, you know, as you know, there are so many people who don't know how to be religious without there being God or without being the Bible. You know, and so, you know, that is the beauty of our faith's innovation. And I think what gift we can bring to our own understanding, and I think perhaps Unitarian Universalism, is some practice and some expression and proclamation of a grounded theological claim that could underlie a real doctrine of sin and salvation. So just a tiny little sign.
Yeah. Not much.
So anyway, so this is the part of me, this is the part of me that you know that smiles when I come up with it, because I know that it's a lot. But I only come up with it because you guys are all capable. I mean, you know, I only bring assignments that I know the class seems ready to handle. So anyway. So.
I don't know. I think you might be a little sadistic.
It's
a little evil.
Write a few sentences. I made sure to write them in blood.
A few sentences boiled down from, yeah.
Oh yeah. I mean, yeah. So, you know, think of a definition of sin, a definition of salvation. He'll talk about social salvation later in this text. So we're getting towards the end. So, you know, I do like to try and keep us to our appointed hour or 90 minutes. And I haven't heard from everyone. Have I heard anything from, I haven't heard much from Shirley. You doing all right tonight, Shirley?
I'm a bit tired tonight, so I'm just listening.
I know you do a lot of Zoom, so, you know, I appreciate it.
I miss hearing from Shirley because we think a lot alike sometimes.
All right, it's Chris has something. Go ahead, Chris.
I don't really have anything to say right now, but I find this interesting. When the question was asked if you have to believe in God to have a theology, I really don't. I agree with you completely on that. And my best quote is, "Religion is far too important to be left to conservative Christians to handle."
Right.
And it's important to a well-educated person that they understand all the traditions of faith and build their own faith around that. So that I truly believe that. There's one other little tiny point, and this is, we have to realize he went on a kind of a trip here for several pages about alcohol, especially at one point in the whole thing. You have to realize we're 2 years away from prohibition, where the country's about to outlaw completely alcohol, and it was really felt for many progressive people to be the root of all evil in society. And if it could be just stamped out, everything would be just fine. So that's a little bit of context.
Nope, that's a great thing to remind folks of, because one of the things that's true about that is also that kind of elitist understanding of some folks, even in Rauschenbusch's circles, that, you know, alcoholism was ruining the working class, and we needed to save them from themselves. It's a little bit paternalistic, some of the movements towards prohibition. And one thing you should also know is that, you know, the long-serving minister of this congregation, Edgar Swan Weirs, was an outspoken prohibitionist. He was very outspoken about prohibition. And celebrated its passing. So that's part of this congregation's history, which is very interesting considering, you know, some things I've witnessed from time to time. I'll leave that at that. So we have a different understanding of these things today, which doesn't mean we're right. It's just a different understanding. So I want to be clear about that too.
Well,
So,
I think at least we acknowledge the fact that alcohol's long term, particularly from their perspective as how it's influencing the working class, was not being recognized as self-medication. And we've come to realize that alcoholism in a large part is secondary to other problems the society has or has not addressed.
It also was in part a anti-Catholic play in that the immigrant groups like the Irish, Italians who used wine and beer or whatever more than the Protestants were, thought to be people who needed direction, and
that's exactly correct. Many of you may not know this, but I know it because it's my home state. The state of Maryland, which was founded as a Catholic colony here on these shores, was the only state in the United States that did not ratify prohibition. And so people from the beginning of prohibition could go to places in Maryland, primarily Frederick, Baltimore, Annapolis, and Cumberland, which were the 4 biggest cities at the time. And you could get alcohol anywhere you wanted. And this caused a big problem with the federal government because, Maryland surrounds Washington, D.C. So they sort of had a bargain that there would be a big bust once a year in Baltimore that would make the national news to make the rest of the country think Maryland wasn't getting away with it. But Maryland got away with it. And I knew tavern owners whose fathers, kept their bars open through prohibition, and they probably had to pay some more protection money to the cops and the mob, but they stayed open. And the reason being, read the tracts that were supporting prohibition, especially the closer it got to 1919, the worse the language and rhetoric became. There's a line that says, we need to defend our culture from the barbarous ways of the teeming hordes storming our shores with their nasty ways. It wasn't nasty, I can't remember the word, unholy ways. And so there was really a belief that, and so Maryland was Catholic and immigrant. They're like, no, you're not taking away my wine, you're not taking away my beer, and you can go be Puritans in New England. And that'll help you understand a little bit about me, because there is not an ounce of Puritan blood in my veins. So just to be clear, even though our faith was founded around Boston, sometimes the problems that I think Unitarian Universalism has is because there's too much Puritan blood that remains. It just gets redirected. No Puritan blood here.
Now I know why you wanted me to take the class.
So I'm just going to read a little bit from this. It's location 15 on Kindle, but it's chapter 6, and it begins a better and more Christian method. So he's going to start talking about the kingdom of God, and this is where he comes up with a concept that today we might call the beloved community. So if you think of beloved community, when he says kingdom of God, it may make a little more sense to you. And so he's starting to talk about the vision of a better society. So what he says, the positive ideals of social righteousness contained in the person of Christ and in the kingdom of God, we see sin as the treasonable force which frustrates and wrecks these ideals and despoils the earth of their enjoyment. And then he goes back to Adam. He says it's Christ who convicts the world of sin, not Adam. The spiritual perfection of Jesus consists in the fact that he was so simply and completely filled with the love of God and man that he gave himself to the task of the kingdom of God, or the beloved community, without any reservation or backsliding. And this is the true standard of holiness. That the fact that a man is too respectable to get drunk or to swear is no proof of his righteousness. His moral and religious quality must be measured by the intelligence and single-heartedness with which he merges his will and life in the divine purpose of the beloved community. So by contrast, the person's sinfulness stands out in its true proportion, not when he is tripped up by ill temper or sidesteps into shame, but when he seeks to establish a private kingdom of self-service and is ready to thwart and defeat the progress of humankind toward peace, justice, or a fraternal organization of economic life, sharing the fruits of the economy, because that would diminish his political privileges, his unearned income, or his power over the working classes. So right there, he gets to start articulating that notion of the beloved community. Did you ever find the page? It's page 52 for those in the book, not in the Kindle. And so this is where we're headed. And so he is redefining sin because he needs to get someone focused on something instead of just shaming one another. He talks in this section of readings that, you know, that there was a minister who was more worried about if someone had lied or said a curse word than if they were subjecting, you know, thousands of people to misery by their economic choices and their power. And so that's what we can hold on to with Rauschenbusch. And I expect you to continue to find things that irritate you. Some will confuse you. And as much as you can, swat them away to get at the good stuff. And start writing your treatises. Chris has already started his preamble. He just gave it to us. You know, his preamble is already ready. So,
What's our reading?
So our reading is going to be the next 5 chapters. So you went through chapter 7. So it's going to be 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Let me make sure that's 100% correct. I'm going to stop you at some point because some of it just gets ridiculous. Yes, and then, yes, so just make it 8, 9, 10, and 11. Let's just do 8, 9, 10, 11. And then the week after, we'll do 12 and 13. And that's pretty much all we're going to do in the text. The later chapters are really just theological calisthenics and dog and pony tricks to keep you know, from not considering the social gospel. That's my interpretation. Read them, bring them up. There's something amazing or maddening in them, but that's kind of what we're going to focus on. And so next week will be our 4th class. Then the class after that, we'll do a little bit to wrap up the book, and then we'll start moving towards the conversation of how do we develop a meaningful and useful, grounded doctrine of sin and salvation that we can share with others who may not be Unitarian Universalists and maybe recognize it as a religious principle. No, just a tiny little assignment.
Tiny little assignment.
It's collaborative, right?
And it's collaborative. Yeah, yes, Moxie.
How do you propose salvation from a not necessarily Christian's perspective?
Yes.
Salvation is if not wholly Christian, it may be wholly Abrahamic.
Exactly. So we will come to that notion next week. In short, just to plant the seed, you know, salvation, that which saves. What builds a common culture and society where people can achieve their potential or have the possibility of achieving their potential without oppression, without misery, without being exploited. Those are the kind of things that he's actually going to use to define salvation. He still has the other notion of salvation, but he, in many ways, seems to be leaning towards universalism in this text too, meaning all people are saved. He won't come out and say it because he wants the conservatives to keep reading, but there's 4 or 5 places, including in tonight's reading, he brings up 2 universalist proof texts, Romans 5 and 1 Corinthians 15, both of which are universalist proof texts, which basically says, as in Adam all died, so in Christ all shall live. Not so in Christ everyone who does these things shall live. It says in Christ all shall live. So that universal salvation notion is that once Jesus came and went through what he went through, all humanity was saved. We don't have to use that doctrine, but he's leaning towards universal salvation. And so we're looking at social salvation. And that'll be the hardest one. Salvation will be much harder for us to define than what we said. But anyway, and 1 Corinthians 15, yes. They have almost the same lines.
It's certainly going to be hard for it to not be perceived as political.
I know,
Everything is political
that's true.
now.
That's exactly right. Well, it was then too.
Yeah.
It was then too, but I think it's in a different scale these days, but yeah, that's
Well,
right.
I think
Okay.
you're.
Bye, guys.
Yeah, all right.
Good
Love
night.
you all very much.
Okay,
Thank
yeah,
you.
take care.
Thanks.
Night all.